Welcome back for another book review. Today we are talking about this one. So this is The Art of Faery Magick by DJ Conway. This is one that I have had for like ever, and I finally decided to just read it. It's not a topic I particularly care about, so I will say I don't know how good the information is. Working with the Fae is just not something I'm really interested in. It's similar to numerology where it's like, it's kind of cool, but like, there's just certain parts of the whole community that, like, you know, you get into your niches of stuff like numerology or Fae, and like sometimes it just triggers parts of my brain to be like, oh, pumping the brakes on this one. Like, I cannot suspend disbelief for this. And so it's just not something I really, like, go into. Like, do I think that there's, like, beings that are out there in the world on, like, a slightly different plane outside of human existence? Totally. Do I think we're the top of the food chain of, like, all of the creatures that exist, seen and unseen? Definitely not. Do I think the Fae are as described in this book? Not really. So, the way this is described is definitely, like, I had a hard time with it. I was like, this is the most stereotypical book I have ever read on the Fae. Wow. So I don't know if that's just like a thing, if that's just how the Fae are described, that they have like the king and the queen, but like I know it definitely had a Wiccan element to it because there was so much focus on the goddess and the god. So like, you know, there's Wicca put in. I just don't know how much is like transferred into other communities that aren't Wiccan, that work with the Fae, and I know like there's like a whole branch of paganism that's just focused on them, and so I don't know how much is different from that community compared to this. I don't know. I will say, comparing this book with some of the others from DJ Conway, it's like, I don't know how much was like a creative license. Like, again, I think of the Norse book, and like the Norse things mentioned here were kind of like, I don't know about that. And like, I wanted to, like, I would love to have more information from not DJ Conway on the topic, where we are talking about modern practitioners working with the idea of the elves and the dwarves in a like Norse context, because that is something I do want to learn about, and how that works with like the land spirits. And I know they have a name and I don't know how to pronounce it because it's a language that like I look at it and I'm like, it looks like we whacked a keyboard. I don't know how to pronounce these words. It's not my native language. So like, while we share the same alphabet, that's about it. Like, I don't know. There's silent letters and then there's not, and like just, it's a whole thing. So I don't know how to say it, but land spirits, which are similar in some ways, I think, to the Fae. They're a little bit different. I don't know. Again, it's not something I know very well. But the way DJ Conway talks about the fairies here, I had to suspend disbelief a lot. Some of it I could kind of get on board with. Like, I've heard plenty of people talk about finding the Fae in like flowers, and like to have a fairy garden, and to not piss them off. Like, little things like that, but then, much like a DJ Conway book, she actively is like, well, don't work with these. But she will give you extreme details on it, and you're like, then why are you telling me about it? If you don't want people to, like, whatever. She does that a lot in her books, and that was definitely the case here. Some of the ones I really questioned, like the ones where she's talking about, like, the desert fairies, I'm like, you're thinking of one specific type of desert. There are multiple. Like, I have never seen this, so I cannot confirm nor deny, but I don't know that, like, deserts on other continents have, like, cactus, and that the desert plants are all what we think of, where you think of, like, kind of the southwest of the US, Arizona, lower California, even, like, some southern Utah, like, that little area. Because even, like, if you go too far east, you got more moisture, so it's not really the desert side of it. It's just hot and moist all the time. This is, like, the dry desert. And honestly, I could tell she's thinking, like, Arizona, Southern California, because she's talking about, like, how dry and how it's like, go get a cactus. And I'm like, you know there's other plants, right, that live in a desert And again, I'm pretty sure deserts in other places, again, not our continent, we're talking others. I'm sure there's deserts on South America, probably Central America, maybe. I mean, it is kind of narrow, so maybe it doesn't have as many deserts, but I feel like it does. Anyways, but I'm like, think of like Egypt. Like, I've never seen Egypt depicted with cactus, yet it is a desert. So it just made me question things, and also Utah is classified as a desert. We do not get enough rainfall to qualify as not a desert. But she even was like, well, in like semi-deserts. I'm like, are you talking about Utah? Is that what we're talking about? Because like, we definitely have like not water. Like, we get our water mostly from snow. Other than that, we definitely don't get enough water to like sustain existence through rainfall throughout the year. And I'm pretty sure like other states around are kind of in a similar boat. Like, we have plants here, like the native plants don't require a lot of water. And yet she doesn't talk about that. She doesn't talk about like finding sagebrush and juniper trees. Like, she doesn't talk about that. It's just cactus. And so because of that alone, it made me question the other ones. And like, she talks about all of these other cultures so briefly and so randomly, and like, I just question it. I feel like sometimes we need the context of those cultures before we just jump in with like assumptions on them. Because there was a lot of like Japanese culture and Chinese culture, and I'm like, I feel like cultural context between like Eastern, because it's just kind of lumped together a lot of times, and then Western, like, there's gonna be some differences, but also like the cultural impact I feel like needs to be a little bit more included, because like she talks about like dragons in a little bit of like Europe basically, and then compared to the Chinese dragon, and I'm like, true, but does that also include were there dragons in like India? Like, there's a lot of other places that's not just China and Japan. Like, there's a lot of other countries right around there, and a lot of other cultures that have been around for like ever over there. Was it the same over there when we're saying Eastern? And just stuff like that. And I'm like, I feel like the cultures they came from needed to have more of an emphasis on how the Fae and how dragons and unicorns and all of these things kind of worked. Most of us are pretty familiar with like the UK. So like Irish, Scottish, English, Wales, I think there's other places, but that general region of the world, we're kind of familiar with it. But even then, they kept saying how there's like differences in like the leprechauns from this way versus this way, and the fae and this, and then there's the small folk, and then there's the, like, there was just so much that I'm like, I feel like we could have maybe organized this better at least, to be like, we're just gonna talk about these ones in all their context instead of bouncing throughout the book constantly. Like, I just feel like it could have been, like, organized better for somebody who has no idea what's going on. And again, the, like, meditations she has you go through, I don't really love the written meditations anyways in a book, but, like, this was fun, to say the least. Because they're always described in the exact same way. And it's a very specific type of clothing from a very specific type of time. And, like, the idea of them having, like, a king and a queen, like, who's to say they have a, like, why would they not have, like, a parliament? Or a congress? Or a republic? Why is it always a king and a queen? Like, just stuff like that. I had to pump the brakes and, like, just acknowledge this ain't for me. And so I just kind of had to keep going with that, because it's not something I care about. When I think of the Fae, I don't picture a lot of this book. And so if you're into the Fae, and if, I don't know if this is a good book or not. It's not a topic I know terribly well. I do know from context of other books by DJ Conway, typically you need to do further research, so maybe that's the case. But as somebody who went into this book knowing very little about the Fae, I have left this book knowing very little about the Fae. Because it's so confusing, and it's just so all over the place. Again, if we had chapters dedicated to going into detail and like how to work with and experience them in not flowery language, like that might have been more helpful, to be like, here are the brownies, and like we're just talking about that. Then But even then, like, we kind of bounce around and there's always examples thrown in from all over the world. Like, it felt kind of confusing to me, and again, I'm not that interested. So like when the Norse things would come up, it was like, oh cool, but then it never really was explained in a way that made sense to me. To other people, maybe if you know more about the Fae, it would make more sense. And so I'm just hoping that that's the case, because again, it's not something I really care about. Like, I'm interested to learn how modern people who work with the Norse, not necessarily claiming the title of Norse pagan, because that community tends to be anything with the Norse tends to be extremely toxic. So it's rough to be like, how does that culture in particular view the elves and the dwarves, and how do you work with them in that context? And I think there's like one person, but like, last time I checked, the individual was extremely cult-like, so not going there. But like, for the most part, there's not like a huge discussion. So I don't know. So like, I left this book just going, but how would modern, how? And like, it doesn't give the context for that alone. Because again, other stuff I don't know. So like, for me, I was looking at it, I'm like, well, aren't the dwarves and the elves supposed to be on different realms? Like, they're not supposed to be in Midgard. They have their own lands that I don't know how to pronounce. But like, we're in Midgard for the humans. How are they supposed to be on like a different world on the tree? So like, are the worlds overlapping? Or how? Not even discussed in here. It's just like, oh yeah, in Iceland, in Scandinavia, in Germany. And you're like, cool. How does that work though? And the only other thing they mentioned was like, oh, well, this kind of thing came over from the Vikings. That's the only thing we can think of. And I'm like, cool. Can we have the context within that culture though? Because again, if like they're supposed to have their own worlds, how does that work? And so because of that, I question the other ones and like how much, like, you know, like, again, cultural context matters. Are they traveling out of the other realms along the world tree for the Norse version? Don't know. She never talks about it. So because of that, it left me really just more confused. And honestly, having got to the end, I'm still confused just as much as I was going into this book. And I think the biggest part is that you really have to do a lot more research into the like Fae and like all of the fairy traditions that exist. And I don't think this would be a great book because as somebody who definitely I wouldn't even say beginner, just like has heard about it in passing kind of a thing, like how much of this is Wiccan influence, her influence, like her stories at the end of the book were like, they were wild to say the least. So I don't know. It's not a book I recommend, but I also know I'm not the intended audience and I don't know enough about the topic to really say. I can only base it off of this stuff I was interested in that didn't really line up or make a lot of sense to me. So that said, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments down below. Huge thank you to my patrons. I'll have their names here on the screen. If you'd like to support me and get access to exclusive content, it is patreon.com/nightwillowcrafts. Make sure to like and subscribe. I post every single day. And until next time, thank you so much for watching and blessed be.